This is a lump of coking coal. Black, dense, unremarkable. Burns hot enough to smelt iron into steel. China consumes 700 million tons of coking coal annually, more than the rest of the world combined. Without this coal, Chinese steel mills stop. Without Chinese steel mills, global construction stops. Mongolia sits on 10% of the world's coking coal reserves. For 30 years, that coal has flowed south across the Gobi Desert to Chinese smelters, funding Mongolian government operations, employing Mongolian workers, sustaining Mongolian independence. 3 days ago, China decided that flow would no longer be voluntary. On January 20th, 2026, at 5 a.m. Ulaanbaatar time, Mongolian President Kirill Ukna was awakened by his national security advisor with news that Chinese military units had crossed the border at 3 points, Zamin-ud, Gashunsukait, and Shivikuren, and were establishing resource security zones around Mongolia's largest coal mining complexes. Not an invasion, not formally. The Chinese called it emergency infrastructure protection in response to terrorist threats against critical supply facilities. The Mongolian government received no advance warning, no consultation, no opportunity to address whatever threats China claimed existed. By sunrise, 12,000 Chinese troops occupied positions around mines that produce 40 million tons of coking coal annually. By noon, Chinese state mining companies had arrived to ensure operational continuity. By evening, Mongolia's primary source of export revenue was under foreign military control. This is not a border dispute. This is annexation by another name. And the 3.4 million people of Mongolia are watching their nation disappear into Chinese absorption while the world does nothing. Here's what they're not telling you. Mongolia's strategic vulnerability has been obvious for decades. A nation of 3.4 million people wedged between Russia, 146 million, and China, 1.4 billion, survives through careful balancing, maintaining relationships with both giants while depending on neither exclusively. The balance has always been precarious. Mongolia has no coastline. Every import and export must cross Russian or Chinese territory. The Trans-Mongolian Railway connects to both nations' networks, but connections can be closed as easily as opened. China has been Mongolia's largest trading partner since 2000. Bilateral trade exceeds $11 billion annually, 85% of Mongolia's total foreign trade. Chinese companies have invested billions in Mongolian mining, infrastructure, and construction. The economic integration has been deep, and until 3 days ago, apparently mutual. The integration masked dependency. Mongolia needed Chinese markets more than China needed Mongolian resources. Chinese coking coal imports from Mongolia could be replaced, expensively, disruptively, but replaceable, from Australia, Russia, or domestic sources. Mongolian coal exports could not be replaced at all. China was the only customer at scale. The asymmetry created leverage that China chose not to exercise, until the global resource competition made Mongolian coal too valuable to leave in Mongolian hands. At 7:30 a.m. Ulaanbaatar time on January 20th, I obtained communications between Mongolian government officials through a source in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The communications reveal panic that official statements have carefully concealed. Chinese forces have surrounded Tavan Tolgoi. Mining operations continue under Chinese military supervision. Our personnel have been confined to administrative buildings. We have no communication with site workers. The Chinese commander refuses to meet with our representatives. Tavan Tolgoi is the world's largest untapped coking coal deposit, estimated reserves of 7.4 billion tons. The deposit's development has been Mongolia's primary economic development strategy for 2 decades. International companies, Rio Tinto, Peabody, Japanese consortiums, have competed for development rights. Those competitions are now moot. Chinese forces control the site. Chinese companies are operating the mines. International agreements regarding Tavan Tolgoi are being ignored. At 9 a.m. Beijing time on January 20th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian addressed the military deployment in terms that redefined reality. China has responded to urgent requests from legitimate Mongolian stakeholders concerned about terrorist threats to critical resource infrastructure. Chinese security forces are providing temporary protection until Mongolian authorities can ensure facility security. This is a cooperative action consistent with bilateral friendship. The statement's lies were layered. No Mongolian stakeholder requested Chinese intervention. No terrorist threats existed. Mongolian intelligence services have confirmed no credible threats against mining facilities. The temporary protection shows no signs of ending. The framing as cooperative action adds insult to occupation. China is describing military seizure of foreign territory as bilateral cooperation, a formulation that Mongolians find both absurd and terrifying. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. China's resource grab follows a pattern established across its periphery, a pattern that the international community has repeatedly failed to counter. In the South China Sea, China constructed artificial islands on disputed reefs, militarized them despite promises not to, and now claims sovereignty over waters international law designates as open ocean. The world protested. China ignored the protests. The islands remain. In Xinjiang, China established a surveillance and detention system targeting Uyghur Muslims, an ethnic minority whose homeland sits atop significant oil and gas reserves. The world documented abuses. China denied them. The system continues. In Tibet, China has controlled the region since 1950, 76 years of occupation that the world initially condemned and has since largely accepted. Tibetan resources, water, minerals, strategic position, serve Chinese interests, while Tibetans remain marginalized in their own land. The pattern is consistent. Assert control, deny illegitimacy, wait for international attention to fade, normalize the new reality. The pattern works because the international community lacks will to impose costs that exceed China's tolerance for punishment. Mongolia is the next application of the pattern. The mines are occupied, the denial is issued, the waiting begins. At 11 a.m. Ulaanbaatar time on January 20th, President Kurulsuk addressed the nation in a televised statement that revealed the limits of Mongolian options. Mongolia condemns the unauthorized entry of foreign military forces onto Mongolian sovereign territory. We demand immediate withdrawal and restoration of Mongolian control over all mining facilities. Mongolia calls upon the international community to support our sovereignty and territorial integrity. The demands will not be met. The international support will not materialize in forms that matter. Kurulsuk knows this. His statement was addressed less to Beijing than to history, creating a record that Mongolia objected even when objection was futile. At 1 p.m. Moscow time on January 20th, Russia's response, or non-response, became clear. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zakharova stated that Russia was monitoring the situation and encouraged dialogue between neighbors. The statement's neutrality was itself a statement. Russia and Mongolia have a mutual defense treaty dating to 1966. The treaty theoretically obligates Russia to defend Mongolian territorial integrity. Russia is not defending Mongolian territorial integrity. Russia needs Chinese economic partnership more than Russia needs to honor treaty obligations to a nation of 3.4 million people. The calculus is brutal and obvious. Mongolia's treaty with Russia provides no protection against China. The protection was always theoretical, useful for diplomatic positioning, worthless when tested. Less than 72 hours have passed since Chinese forces crossed the border. The speed of subsequent developments reveals pre-planning that extends months or years before the physical occupation. Hour 0 to 12. Military deployment establishes control over mining complexes. Communications with international partners disrupted through technical difficulties. Hour 12 to 24. Chinese state companies arrive with operational staff, equipment, and contracts pre-drafted for signature. Mongolian mining executives presented with choices: sign partnership agreements or be removed from sites. Hour 24:48. First coal shipments under new operational structure depart for Chinese steel mills. The shipments demonstrate that production continues regardless of Mongolian government objections. Hour 48:72. Chinese engineering teams begin infrastructure assessment for efficiency improvements. The assessments precede permanent facility modifications that will integrate Mongolian mines into Chinese industrial networks. The timeline's efficiency reveals that every element was prepared in advance. The emergency response to terrorist threats was executed with precision that emergencies don't permit. The operation was planned, rehearsed, and implemented according to schedule. At 3:30 p.m. Ulaanbaatar time on January 21st, I spoke with a Mongolian mining executive whose company operates, or operated, facilities now under Chinese control. The executive requested anonymity, fearing retaliation against family members. They presented contracts yesterday. Sign, and your company becomes a minority partner in a Chinese joint venture. Refuse, and your company loses all access to your own facilities. The contracts were printed in Beijing. They had our company details already filled in, information they could only have obtained through prior intelligence collection. I asked about the contract terms. Mongolian entities retain 20% ownership of operations we previously owned 100%. Chinese partners receive 80%. Revenue sharing follows ownership. We receive 20% of profits from mines we built, we staffed, we operated for decades. The alternative to signing is receiving nothing. I asked about resistance options. What resistance? Chinese soldiers control the gates. Chinese managers control the operations. Chinese trucks carry the coal. We can refuse to sign and be excluded entirely. We can sign and retain 20% of something rather than 100% of nothing. Most companies are signing. What choice do we have? The coerced partnerships transform Mongolian mining from national industry to Chinese subsidiary. The transformation is achieved through contracts signed under duress, legally questionable but practically irreversible. When small nations are absorbed by large neighbors, the regional implications cascade beyond immediate victims. Central Asian calculation. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan all share borders with China. Each controls resources China wants: oil, gas, uranium, rare earths. Each has observed China's treatment of Mongolia. Each is recalculating the reliability of Chinese partnership. At 5 p.m. Astana time on January 21st, Kazakh President Tokayev convened his Security Council. Kazakhstan's Kashagan oil field, one of the world's largest, has received significant Chinese investment. Kazakh officials are now quietly assessing whether that investment creates vulnerability similar to Mongolia's. Russian reconsideration. Russia's non-response to Mongolia's occupation damages Russian credibility across its sphere of influence. Nations that relied on Russian security guarantees observe Russia's failure to honor treaty obligations when the adversary is China. At 7 p.m. Yerevan time on January 21st, Armenian President Khachaturian met with security advisors. Armenia depends on Russian security guarantees against Azerbaijan and Turkey. If Russia won't defend Mongolia against China, will Russia defend Armenia against anyone? The question has no comfortable answer. Russia's security guarantees are revealed as contingent on Russian strategic interest, not alliance obligation. International institutional failure. The United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force against territorial integrity of member states. China's occupation of Mongolian mining facilities constitutes use of force against Mongolian territorial integrity. At 9 p.m. New York time on January 21st, the UN Security Council convened at Mongolia's request. The session lasted 4 hours. China vetoed a resolution calling for withdrawal. Russia abstained. No action was taken. The veto was expected. The expectation doesn't reduce its significance. The international system designed to prevent territorial aggression is confirmed as impotent when aggressors hold veto power. What the informed understand is that Mongolia's absorption represents a template for resource acquisition that legal frameworks cannot prevent. The template has several elements. Create pretext. Invent threats that justify protective intervention. The threats need not be real. They need only be asserted with sufficient confidence. Deploy rapidly. Establish military control before international response can organize. Speed creates facts on the ground that become difficult to reverse. Legalize through contracts. Convert military occupation to commercial partnership through coerced agreements. The agreements provide legal cover that obscures underlying coercion. Wait out attention. International outrage fades. News cycles move on. The occupation becomes normalized through persistence. The template works because response mechanisms are slow and consequences are insufficient. By the time the international community organizes objection, the facts have changed. Reversing changed facts requires effort that exceeds changed circumstances. At 11 p.m. Beijing time on January 21st, Chinese state media began a campaign to normalize the occupation. CCTV aired segments showing Chinese engineers improving Mongolian mining facilities. Xinhua published articles about terrorist cells that Chinese forces had disrupted. The narrative construction was comprehensive and coordinated. The narrative will become accepted truth within China. The domestic audience will understand the occupation as legitimate security response, not territorial aggression. The understanding will support continued occupation indefinitely. At 1 a.m. Ulaanbaatar time on January 22nd, Mongolian Foreign Minister Batmunk Batsetseg released a statement addressed to the international community. Mongolia faces absorption into a neighbor that does not respect sovereignty, does not honor agreements, and does not accept that small nations have rights equal to large nations. We ask the world, if Mongolia can be occupied without consequence, what nation is safe? What border is secure? What sovereignty is real? We do not ask for military intervention. We ask for consequences, economic consequences, diplomatic consequences, consequences that demonstrate that territorial aggression carries costs the aggressor cannot ignore. If there are no consequences, there will be more Mongolias. Today it is us. Tomorrow it may be you. The statement will change nothing. The consequences she requests will not materialize. The prediction about future Mongolias is likely accurate. The lump of coking coal weighs about a pound. Burn it, and it produces heat that transforms iron ore into steel. The transformation built modern civilization: bridges, buildings, machines, infrastructure. Mongolia's coal reserves represent centuries of potential transformation. The coal was supposed to fund Mongolian development: schools, hospitals, infrastructure that would raise 3.4 million people from poverty to prosperity. The coal will now fund Chinese development. The revenue flows to Beijing. The employment flows to Chinese workers imported to operate facilities Mongolians built. The future flows away from a nation that did nothing wrong except exist between giants who wanted what they had. 3 days since occupation, 12,000 troops deployed, 40 million tons of annual production seized, $11 billion in trade redirected to Chinese control. The numbers describe a nation being dismantled in real time. The dismantling continues while the world watches and does nothing effective. Mongolia's flag still flies over government buildings in Ulaanbaatar. Mongolian sovereignty remains theoretically intact. The occupation is temporary. The partnership is voluntary. The contracts are negotiated. The words mean nothing. The coal flows to China. The revenue flows to China. The future flows to China. 3.4 million people, one occupation, 0 consequences. This is what happens when small nations have resources large nations want. This is what happens when international law has no enforcement. This is what happens when might makes right returns as operating principle. The coking coal burns hot enough to smelt steel, but it cannot smelt justice from a world that has none to offer. Mongolia is being absorbed. The world is watching. Nothing is being done. The coal continues to flow south, and 3.4 million people learn what their sovereignty was always worth, whatever China decides to pay, which, as of 3 days ago, is nothing at all.